Thank you, Ramel. Thanks to everyone for being here. We're going to try to make up a little bit of the time that we've fallen behind, but not so much that it gets in the way of having a really good conversation about the themes of the day and about the experience of our guests. We're essentially going to broaden the focus a little bit. We just had some good insights from Heather's panel about the opportunities and obstacles that key industries face in bringing inventions to market and helping them scale up. What I want to do today is, or at least my first appearance of the day, is to approach Canada's challenge in scaling innovations from a different angle, which is the role that an innovation ecosystem can play in commercializing inventions and scaling. Now, ecosystem is a big word. We're going to begin by filling that bucket with some meaning. So we're going to ask our guests, first of all, to talk about what is an innovation ecosystem and what are its key pillars and structures. And I think, Salim, I'll put that question to you first.
Thank you, Paul. So when I think of an innovation ecosystem or an innovation strategy, I sort of envision it being built around three pillars, which are critical to helping activate a critical mass that's important for both economic development and impact. The first is building an innovation ecosystem that helps supports the innovators. These are the entrepreneurs that are building the next generation of companies really driven by science and technology. And in this pillar, I think what we need to do is really effectively nurture and develop talent, connect these young companies to customers' capital and talent so that they can continue to scale, and then ultimately, broaden the impact of these industries that are going to be very, very important to Canada, and I think they're going to be major employers, and I think they're going to unlock value around the sectors that they're in around the world. And so there's a lot that we can do around supporting and helping these companies scale. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar is building an ecosystem around innovation adoption. So how do we get some of these really amazing innovations that are being developed by these entrepreneurs to be a catalyst to solve some of the most pressing problems that we face as a country? So if you think about healthcare, if you think about education, if you think about climate, you think about affordable housing, how can these innovators be catalysts that help us unlock new and different strategies to drive adoption of some of this technology? And I'm not naive to know or to believe that technology alone is going to solve these problems. I think often they can be a catalyst, but what we need to uncover are some of the systemic challenges that perhaps hinder adoption in certain sectors. And so I think we need to spend time and learn around how to do that better. So there's a whole ecosystem strategy around that. And then the third pillar is really around building an ecosystem around policy, regulatory, and standard setting that is going to be important for some of these breakthrough technology areas that are going to have global impact. And I think that we are in a world right now where countries around the world are getting together and are setting policy, setting standards around some of these very, very impactful technologies, like AI, for example. And Canada needs to be at the table. How do we set appropriate guardrails for some of this innovation, but perhaps be creative around our regulatory approaches to be experimental and to really help facilitate adoption in new and innovative ways. And we're entering an era right now where there is going to be a technology cold war between the U.S. and China in many of the technology sectors, and supply chains and value chains are being recast in real time today. And we need to figure out how Canada is going to participate in that so that our entrepreneurs don't get left behind.
Okay. There's a lot to unpack there, but probably I'll go to the other guests for opening rounds. And Karimah, you have been involved in this central question, which is how do we, especially in the life sciences sector, how do we have not just thriving firms, but a thriving space that involves several firms, public sector input, labor market. What are your thoughts on how we develop these kinds of innovation ecosystems?
Thank you. I'll just build off on Salim, because really an ecosystem is a community. It's all the pieces of the puzzle that enable that outcome to happen. So, ecosystems vary a little bit, the innovation ecosystems, depending on the sector you're in, but there's some fundamental things that are the same. And so few that I would add to what Salim said was, my big one that, you can see I have a moan about, which is culture, which is the culture of creativity, the culture of risk, the culture of innovation adoption, as Salim mentioned earlier. Nurturing that, nurturing talent, which he spoke about, and I know we're going to have 2 panels on talent, so I'm really not going to spend time on that. But also translation capacities. Places like incubators and accelerators where you can enable technologies to advance, and where entrepreneurs who are first-time entrepreneurs learn about IP and all of those other things and how to commercialize and spin out their companies. Agile regulations I can't emphasize enough, and so working with government and those relationships in building the right kind of enabling regulations. Regulations shouldn't just be about being barriers. And then market access networks, places for sandboxing. So for life sciences, for example, sandboxing, we would need access to clinical trial capabilities and healthcare centers. So this is the uniqueness when we look at the Boston, Massachusetts area and say, why does it all work? Because they have that entire ecosystem, including the hospitals, between MIT and Harvard, where they can access all of that. So, having that. And then the last piece I would say really critical is the capital. And you need capital from startup to scale up. So you need different kinds of capital. But as was discussed earlier, it's not enough to have inward direct, foreign direct investment. You have to have Canadian capital at the table if you want to retain your companies in Canada and scale them here, and if you want to retain your talent here, because both are movable.
We're off to, I think, an excellent start. Iain, same question to you. And
yeah, I know. I mean, I'll try and fill in the gaps where we haven't covered off, but all of those are so central. Especially, I think the one that we've not really talked a lot about publicly is around the opportunity for regulatory frameworks and zones to be able to create opportunities for us to trial and test and deploy products that are being developed, not technologies that are developed, in my humble opinion. I think the other thing that I wanted to focus a bit on is the notion of sort of culture and infrastructure associated with building a successful innovation ecosystem. The first thing that needs to happen is, back to your point, it's about people, right? And so one of the key ingredients that we've seen is the need to get people to move from a sort of dominant self-interest from a me to a we. And I know we is not a great word to say in this town, but from a me to an us, then I'll put it that way. And this notion of moving from scarcity to abundance, this notion that if we gang up together we can take on the world, which is a small nation. But also the notion of intentionality. How do we engineer the kind of community, the kind of ecosystem, the kind of economy that we want, and what is it going to take? What are those ingredients? Capital, culture, talent, but at a more granular level. And inclusiveness, actually less inclusiveness, but more of a, this is really about, it takes a village to raise a child. Everyone's got a role in an ecosystem to ensure that we've got a competitive jurisdiction that's going to attract and retain the right talent, and ensure that people have the resources needed, incubators, accelerators, access to capital, et cetera, to go from launching a company all the way to IPO or some other exit. And that really is something that has become so important is really taking this away from being this is just about tech and this is just about startups, but seeing the role that municipalities play, seeing the role that other industries play, the role that hospitals play as receptors. So making sure that everybody feels like they're part of the strategy and benefiting, and back to that notion of it takes a village. And then the final thing is authenticity. I think that, some of us are old enough that we lived, because we're all talking about how old we are today. Thank you, Stephen. Some of us lived through the benchmarking boondoggles, and we all went to Xerox, and we all went to Disney, and this was the 80s and the 90s. And of course, I think everyone who was thinking about an innovation ecosystem or startup ecosystem went to the Valley. And the thing is that the Valley is not the right strategy to import. It's the wrong strategy to import, and I think increasingly we're seeing why it's the wrong strategy to import, due to a lot of the dysfunctionalities associated with behavior that it incents. But what is the right strategy for a community that's looking at standing up an innovation ecosystem is to look at what is authentic for them. What are the assets they have within their community? What is the culture and the history of the way that they've been able to build successful businesses? And really taking that and having that inform the approach they're going to take, as opposed to, the boondoggles that we would do to try and import Silicon Valley into our community.
It's interesting that all three of you talked about culture. So one of the questions that comes to mind is, does government policy build the kind of culture that you're talking about? And if the answer is yes, then what is the most germane level of government for creating or for incenting the cultures that become innovation ecosystems? And who wants that?
I know I don't.
I can have a kick at it if you want. Look, we are a risk-averse culture and country.
Yeah.
We just look at what we do in our policies. Everything is incremental. It's not disruptive. We can't embrace the disruptive, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the things we need to do here are disruptive and big. And, let's give credit where it's due. There's been, our government, and if you looked at some of the stats that Rommel put up earlier, we have one of the most educated populations in the world with undergrads and PhDs. We have one of the highest, we're in the top 3 in the highest quality of publications and science that's put out there. Where we fall is on the innovation impact piece, right? And if you looked at his numbers, part of that problem is a numbers problem. We are, some $25 billion short of investment into GERD, for our RD&I, compared to the average OECD country. Mm-hmm. So we invest, but we invest incrementally. We invest small amounts. We haven't learned to scale, and we don't invest in scale. And our programs, Canadian programs, are not of those large types like BARDA and DARPA in the US, for example, or other countries. So, that's the first problem. And then the second problem is that we have too many different disparate policy programs from government that are not aligned. They're not synchronized, they're not aligned. And, I'll come back to that later, is because I don't think we have a big strategic, vision and policy that brings all this together.
Yeah. Salim, do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there have been some really incredible programs around the innovator side to really invest in innovation hubs and ecosystems, and Mars and Communitech are examples of some great organizations that exist across Canada. And I think I can't stress enough, although it feels very doom and gloom, we are I think I would speak for all of us, so optimistic about how bold the entrepreneurs are that we are seeing the vision for what they want to build, recognizing that they're building global companies, not simply just Canadian companies, and the level of energy and hustle that we're seeing from these entrepreneurs. It's incredibly exciting. And certainly there's more we could be doing, but we have a really good foundation to build upon. I think there is incredible frustration around our adoption strategies. Mm-hmm. And how do we mobilize corporates? How do we mobilize SMEs? How do we mobilize government to be big adopters of this innovation? And very often our companies get their first customers abroad, not in Canada, because of the challenges and complexities of our market dynamics. And what we've seen from other markets is that innovation, often the adoption urgency is either driven by hyper competition in a market where you're forced to adopt innovation because your competitive peers are driving innovation, and so you have to do that to compete. Adoption can be driven by supply chain modernization. So if a Walmart says, I want to move to an EDI framework for all of my data management, the entire supply chain starts to modernize, and that drives innovation. Or regulatory or policy innovation that can ultimately drive some urgency to comply. And I don't know that we have any of those dynamics in Canada in some of our sectors. And so I think that there is a lot of frustration from the innovators around how can they better mobilize Canada and contribute to some of these challenging issues. And I think we have work to do there. And then also on the regulatory and policy side, I think also we seem to be a little bit behind and missing in action there, and it is worrying that alliances and value chains are being recast, and does Canada truly have a voice at the table? So there's work to be done there as well.
Okay. I asked my slightly mischievous question because when I think of the two most exciting developments in innovation in the country since I've been paying attention to the question, one was the creation of the Perimeter Institute and the implementation of sort of a next generation quantum valley in Waterloo. And the thing that's always struck me about that is that nobody told them to do that. Mike Lazaridis had an idea and off he went. And then the other case is when Navdeep Bains was Minister of Innovation. He used to say, I'll know I've been successful if when I leave we have 10 Shopifys. Depending on how you define things, the counter is still stuck at 1. And my question about Shopify is, who decided we needed the first Shopify? And the answer is Toby and Harley. So that leads to my next prepared question, which is, it's not just a question of where do the ideas come from, it's when the ideas start to sprout up, how do we help them scale and reach market? And what are your thoughts on, there's already been a couple thoughts on deficiencies in helping new ideas scale and reach market. One was alignment of all the different existing programs, and one was the adoption strategies. What are the other gaps that you would identify, and what are the policies or approaches that seem more promising?
Well, I think that and Salim's going to talk about AI in a minute. I'm not going to steal your thunder, my friend. But I think that one of the successes that we've had as a country is the Mike Lazaridis strategy, which is make a big freaking bet and resource to the right level, and make sure that you're investing in both the research and the science and the application, and resource at a level so that it's got runway for 20 to 30 years. And I think that that's an effective strategy that we've seen deployed that we'd love to see a lot more of. The deficiencies really change over time, and they change very, very quickly, and often policy doesn't catch up with the fact the world has changed. And I do always caution that maybe we beat ourselves up a bit too much. I mean, Bird, I always wonder about whether or not there's spillover from the US, but Stephen can speak to that better than I can. He probably would disagree with me. So I'm not sure that we truly recognize the fact, the intimacy of the relationship with America as we think about these major markers that we like to shine on walls. But I think the other thing too is that, I worked at Nortel and we ruled the waves in the world as not just one company, but thousands of companies in that space. And there was a bust, a big bust, and we all recovered. And I started at Communitech in 2003. There was no startups. First of all, we had to convince people to do startups. Then we had to, once they got to a point of being significant, we had to think about what they needed. There was a doldrum period where there was no growth capital in the country whatsoever, and there were fire sales, and it was horrible. And people fled. People fled for America. Much of those things have changed. I mean, growth rounds are, it was 1.6, 1.8 billion, and Waterloo Regional Loan was raised last year in VC. So the deficiencies are always a bit of a moving target. I think the key is to make sure that we're solving the problem that still exists, and that's something that I think that policy is not always paying attention to. The other thing I think is that at the end of the day, so much of this comes down to talent. And I think that America has been successful and California has been successful being able to attract and retain the world's smartest people, and I think that's really our big opportunity. And I think that things like, we look at the impact the Perimeter Institute has had on attracting world-class theoretical physicists and quantum mathematicians. It works. It works, and it has a massive impact, not just for a few people, but for entire supply chains.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, we have many examples like Perimeter. You have Triumph. We have the world's largest medical isotope cyclotron, which, I don't think most Canadians know that the world's largest cyclotron in medical isotopes is in Canada. It's not CERN. And from it have spun out 5 companies that are, two of them are already unicorns and, are on NASDAQ, and so on and so forth. And we have many other organizations like that. The challenge becomes that we have too much of startup. We can't be a startup nation. So we don't want to be what Israel was. And also the US isn't always our model. We need to, if we look at Finland and we look at some of the Scandinavian countries and what they're doing, we tend to actually resonate better with that in terms of our ecosystem approach and so forth. But I would say that capital and talent are the 2 big pieces. So talent, we produce talent, and I'll tell you that in some of these, high-tech, high-paying areas, we lose 7 out of 10 kids that graduate out of our top universities go and work abroad. Okay, so we don't have the jobs to anchor them here, and we don't have that because we don't have enough big anchor companies with those kinds of jobs and opportunities. We don't have the anchor companies because if you don't have Canadian capital, lots of foreign capital and foreign VCs. I'm a VC and we're a global VC. We invest all over the world. Every company I've invested in Canada, my 9 other partners, 90% will be foreign. You don't have enough Canadian capital. So we have it, but there's not enough, number 1. And number 2, we don't have the scale for scaling up. So again, somebody mentioned earlier around pension funds and, OMERS and Caisse Depot and others. We see them investing in US technologies and US tech companies and European ones. Why isn't there a Canadian fund, it's Canadian taxpayer money, where there is an investment, for scale-up of companies on merit, here? And so, we are missing some of those big funding pieces in Canada.
You talk about the idea of greatly expanding investment capital. Is the New Canada Growth Fund, of which the Deputy Minister of Finance is very fond, $15 billion, supposed to be rolled out by the end of this year, which is tomorrow. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
Well, that's a part of it, and that's part of, sort of government-specific programs. It's a part of it. But I think that we need, true Canadian venture. That's not just for startup. We have a lot for the startup phase, but we don't have enough for the scale-up. So we need more than that.
So Paul, can I quickly just touch on the case study for AI? Because I think that maybe that's a good example of a policy and a strategy that's worked really well. So in 2017, Canada was one of the very first countries in the world to put together a pan-Canadian AI strategy, where we publicly declared that Canada was going to be a leader in the research and commercialization of AI technologies. And so the pan-Canadian strategy revolved around a couple of key investment areas. The first was increasing investment into research in the field of AI through CFAR and other organizations so that we could attract researchers to the fields of deep learning and reinforcement learning and some of these innovations that are changing the world today that were pioneered by Canadians right here in Canada, and how could we do more of that? And so I think investing in science and technology research was critical. That was the first part of the strategy. The second was to put together research institutes, the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence in Toronto, Mila in Montreal, and Amy in Edmonton, to really work with academic partners to build talent in the field of AI, so graduate more master's and PhD level candidates, and also help these researchers translate their innovation, their research, to commercial applications. And I think that those institutes are playing a pivotal role in really catalyzing that type of work. When Vector first started as a case study alone, it had 7 affiliated faculty and researchers that were belonging to the organization. Today, Vector has over 2,800 affiliated faculty and researchers from around the world that are affiliated with the work that they're doing. And so those institutes are incredibly important to develop talent and also advance research and then drive that research into commercial opportunities with corporate partners, SMEs, and startups. We then mobilized immigration, because what we also felt was it wasn't simply going to be enough to homegrown our own talent. We needed to bring in talent from around the world that wanted to focus on these fields and contribute to the strategy. And so we tapped into the Global Skills Visa in order to bring in and accelerate a high-profile talent, highly technical and research-oriented talent to really help build the momentum. And those investments, and the Pan-Canadian AI strategy has now just recently been refreshed, so there is more investment going into it. But what we are seeing coming out of that work is, number one, the incredible talent that we've now built and the expertise that we've built in AI is, first of all, attracting FDI into the country, because companies around the world who are pivoting their own organizations and want to be in the field of AI believe that the best talent in the world is here in Canada. And so we are attracting incredible investments into the country that is only going to scale this ecosystem as we continue to do it. So that's been very exciting. Secondly, is we're spinning out now a new generation of entrepreneurs that are very specialized on AI approaches to innovation. And they are the best in the world because of the pedigree that we've built around them and the ecosystem that we've built around them. And we're using AI now to solve problems in healthcare, in manufacturing, in transportation, in healthcare. So it's not simply just a blunt tool that we develop generically, but we're able to really focus it on some key areas that can be quite critical for Canada. And we're unlocking incredible innovation, which has been really, really fantastic. And it was in this environment in 2019 that myself and my co-founders realized that there was going to be a unique opportunity to provide specialized capital to this very sophisticated ecosystem that was being developed. And so we raised and launched Radical Ventures in 2019, and today we've raised just over $800 million to fund the innovators that are building and scaling in this field in order to really help put us on the map in a big, big way. And we've been fortunate to have investors like CPP and other pension funds who are very, very large investors in our capital strategy. And so we've been able to mobilize capital now, which is really important, and mobilize capital at scale, which is Canadian capital, which is important for everyone. And so I feel like it's a great case study or a playbook that we could look at to say, how do we replicate some of these tools and approaches and lessons as we look at other sectors like life sciences or regenerative medicine or manufacturing or semiconductors? Can Canada play a unique role? And how, if we've made one investment in the AI sector, how do we overlap these sectors so that we can unlock value in these convergence areas when you look at AI in manufacturing or AI in healthcare? And so there's an opportunity to really level up this strategy and really differentiate Canada in a really great way. But I don't know that we talk enough about this great success that we're seeing and experiencing. But I kid you not, Canada is one of the top 3 or 4 countries in the world right now driving innovation in this field that is going to be so impactful over the next 20, 30, 40 years and needs to be a core part of our economic development strategy as a country.
Salim, can I just, a couple of things I think are really important, and I want to ask you one other question, sorry.
No.
Is that, the interesting thing is the sort of the democratic aspect of AI and the fact that this strategy has been working with a lot of established firms, financial service, banks, other types of firms, helping them build AI capability at the applied level, which will make them so critical to competitiveness. Yeah. The other thing is, if you could just talk briefly about 2 portfolio companies to give a sense of the diversity of application and opportunity that goes so far beyond technology, as far as talking about maybe home building and healthcare with Signal.
So we've invested, for example, in a company called Promise Robotics, and Promise Robotics is applying very advanced AI and robotics to the whole world of construction, more specifically residential construction. So as you all know, we have an affordable housing issue right now. We need to find ways of building better, faster, cheaper housing. What if we were to actually build homes in factories and could actually build homes in a matter of days and assemble them in weeks, rather than taking the months and years it now takes to build housing? Could we drive innovation adoption in the construction sector to rethink this approach to the housing sector? And could we not only use that to solve our own problems here in Canada, but then create an industry that we can export globally in order to lead the global adoption of this type of approach to construction. And so, there's a great example of a homegrown entrepreneur who has incredible skills in robotics and in AI, coupled with another founder who brings incredible experience in development and building. It's a company that's based in Toronto. It has its R&D facility in Edmonton. It's a great opportunity to really, drive change in a very important sector and tackling a very important problem. And it's just one of several innovators that are trying to solve the affordable housing issues that we have today. So that's one example of AI. You may not have thought of that being an AI problem, but it really is. Another, we have a company called Aspect Biosystems in Vancouver. They have invented one of the world's very first 3D printers which prints human tissue. So if you can imagine a day when we actually use our stem cells to print tissue patches to really address organ malfunction in disease areas, it sounds like science fiction, but here's a company in Vancouver that has created the technology and been able to show in its studies that these tissue patches that they're able to develop actually reverse the effects of type 1 diabetes and can really extend the life of a patient's liver if they're waiting for a liver transplant. And we're able to save lives utilizing this technology. And this printer that they've developed uses very advanced computer vision and AI to quality control the printing of these tissues. And they use AI to design the tissue therapeutics that they're applying to different types of therapeutic areas. A really great example of AI being applied in life sciences. And they are creating an industry that the world is now paying attention to. And it's here in our own backyard. And so, these innovations and these innovators are, I think, have the ambition to modernize and invent new sectors. And I think we got to find ways of being able to support their ambition and unlocking the value that they can bring to some of the challenges that we're facing.
Adoption in Canada is a problem, though. So
Yeah.
you've talked about these, and this is across every. I mean, we've got one of the biggest IPOs at $15 billion that Accelera did this year. We cannot get that antibody here in Canada.
Yeah.
We cross over to Seattle if we need it.
Yeah.
So this is the challenge. And yet Canada has a universal healthcare system. It's one of our biggest budget items. We could be the biggest procurement agency for our own innovations. So that's another challenge.
And we also have a federal government that never stops talking about how eager it is to partner with innovative industry.
Yeah.
What goes wrong between the talk and the result?
I think we don't want to change. Our healthcare system seems to be sort of cast in sacrosanct stone. 50 years ago, it was the best healthcare system. Other countries adopted it and improved on it, and we're stuck where we are. Okay. And I'm told it's a big bite in the elephant's leg. I think we have to take that bite. It's one of those boil the frog things that we've got to do. We have to boil the world on it. We have to change. It's very siloed. It's all about cost-driven. It's not a value-based healthcare system, and it's not value-based procurement. And those were some of the recommendations that came out of our industry economic tables. All 6 tables came up with, needing to change some of these regulations around how we operate. Every single one of the tables. And we haven't implemented that. We know what needs to be done.
Okay. And Paul, I think what happens often is we get frustrated trying to collaborate with government with these ideas. And I think we talk on and on about the opportunities and the strategies. But then when it comes to implementation, it feels like everything becomes programmatic and short-term sighted in terms of what can we do in the next year or two. And then these programs that are supposed to build value chains end up just becoming transactional funding programs, and we're not able to actually create and advance industries to be leaders in, and we get mired in the minutia of program management. And I think that that's a function of a political cycle and how decisions are made, but it can become a challenge because some of these sectors are going to take 10, 20, 30 years to really drive leadership in.
So this is going to be a useful bridge to the final question. My final question. I'll curtain raise the final question. There's been a horrible upheaval in Ottawa. I'm the new Deputy Minister of Industry, and you're going to. I've got a meeting after lunch with the Deputy Minister of Finance, and you're going to have to tell me what messages I should bring to the Deputy Minister of Finance for a new plan to encourage the development of innovation ecosystems. And as Heather Scoffield said, you don't get off the stage without giving me some ammunition for my briefing note. But I'm wondering what happened to the old programs. 20 years ago, when Paul Genet, there's my microphone, when Paul Genet worked in the Prime Minister's office, I used to get very excited about innovation policy. And somewhere along the line, I noticed that we have way more announcements of innovation policy than we have innovation in this country. We've got 5 superclusters. We've got an infrastructure bank. We've got Tom Jenkins wrote, I think, at least 3 reports. Karimah came and she wrote a very good report with a short deadline for action.
20 pages. We said action, no more.
And I don't want to mock because everyone who's been working on coming up with these new plans has been thoughtful and in good faith and hopeful for the future of the country. What lessons have we learned from the last 20 years of reports and announcements?
And by the way, before you go further, those reports, 70% says the same thing. So we've identified what needs to be done over the last 40 years, right?
Yeah.
So it's about implementation.
Okay.
So Paul, I think one challenge we have is that none of these programs will garner more investment and more attention if Canadians don't care about it. We can't simply just be talking about the importance of this work to the innovators and the small group of voters that are part of the industry. Mm-hmm. I think we have to be better communicators about how this innovation is going to affect every Canadian, the life of every Canadian, the quality of life of every Canadian in the country. We're now all experiencing the challenges in healthcare, in education, in affordable housing. Investment in innovation can be one of the catalysts to drive some changes and hopefully touch the life of every Canadian in a meaningful way. And so I think one opportunity is to better message why these investments, these strategies are so important, and that it doesn't just touch the top 10% or the top 1% of the Canadian population, but it can be impactful to the entire population.
Public education and public engagement is critical. We've been very poor in doing that compared to many other countries that are leading in innovation. Growth and prosperity will come from building a strong, sustainable innovation economy. Do you think we've communicated that to the average Canadian? Have we ever communicated that? And do we certainly do? During COVID, we had an opportunity, and we now have an opportunity post-COVID, because suddenly the public is very engaged in all matters health and a little bit of science. This is the time to pick up on it and really engage the public, because they're the voters, and I guess, we work around political cycles.
We're getting at eternal problems. Unfortunately, there'll be other panels after lunch to try and get at them. You say educating the public. I was saying to Iain before we came on stage, there's more people working in communications functions in government and business than there is in the history of the wheel. And almost no one seems to be able to get their message out. But that's a problem for another day. The problem for today is I'm off to see the Deputy Minister, and I have to tell him how we're going to. I have to tell him how we're going to incent the growth of ecosystems, so that the innovators in this country have somebody they can have lunch with. What should I tell him?
Go first?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to this is all about talent. And I think that the AI example is such a beautiful example of really starting with talent, and that talent leading all the way through to, and you didn't talk about Signal, which is actually AI technology that's saving lives right here in Ontario and Canada now. So to me, it's about talent, and I think that the jurisdiction that can attract and retain the smartest people in the world will win. And that has to be at scale. And I think Global Talent Stream is a fantastic program within the Government of Canada. We've used it extensively, and it does allow us to be jurisdictionally competitive, which is critical from an immigration perspective, and perhaps more work around how do we use immigration from a competitive perspective. The problem with the decisions around procurement, I mean, there's federal government procurement issues, and then there's procurement issues at every level. And I'm most familiar with the procurement decisions and constraints at the level of hospitals. And it really comes down to the notion of constraints. And there's so many constraints that are built in or manufactured by people on both sides that it is impossible. We were trying to deploy something called Voices, which is a Canadian technology company, which does simultaneous translation. So you don't need translators in hospitals anymore. This technology does it. But they couldn't take the translation budget over here that they would pay people to do physical translation and use it to buy this technology. And it's just a really good example of the constraints that get in the way of hospitals. Hospitals have been pushing for value-based procurement for years and years and years. They would love to be doing more. They'd love to be working with innovators and deploying technology. It's the constraints that are built into these systems. It's calcified to the point of inability to do something that is not, which is new.
So attract talent, break down silos.
Right.
Next.
I would go back to our original recommendation from the Industry Strategy Council, which was you need to have a big vision. You need to talk about that vision all the time, everybody. It has to be a comprehensive 10, 20-year plan. If you look at the UK, you look at any country that's doing it, it's non-partisan. It doesn't matter which government comes in. They've had 3 prime ministers in 3 weeks kind of thing, It doesn't affect this policy. It's a 20-year policy, innovation policy that's aligned, that includes the industrial policy, the skills and talent policy, the trade policies, and the R&D and innovation. It's all aligned under that. And then there's a big budget ticket item to it. Because without money, it doesn't happen. And then there is focus, and we invest and build in our strengths. So it's not about picking winners and losers, but it's picking the sectors that we're world leading in, that we have strength in. Whether it's in the clean tech, it's in the AI sector, it's in the biosciences, it's in agri-technologies. We identified those sectors. And all those recommendations, that needs to happen. We can't do these sporadic ad hoc things and then we'll fund this for 2 years. It'll be a nice announcement. Then we'll do something else. So we feel like we've given everybody a little bit. That's not how you build, a cohesive strategy and an innovation economy.
I can't help sneaking in a short question before we wrap up. Your report's 3 years old. You've said what needs to happen. Is it happening?
Bits of it are happening. I would say, certainly I can only speak to the biosciences side, others can speak to other sectors, but I would say parts of it are happening. Probably the bit that's happened really well is the AI, which was a small part of our report, because health is impacted by AI too. And these are all converging technologies and cross-cutting, as Salim said. So I would say parts of it. We don't do it to scale. The problem is scale and being comprehensive and ecosystem driven.
Okay. Salim, the Deputy Minister is ancient and impatient, and I have to impress him. What on earth will I tell him?
3 things. I think number 1, we have to pick the sectors, as Karimah said, where we can compete and win globally. We can't be good at everything. So what are the 4 or 5 areas where we truly believe we can build companies, drive innovation, and leverage our systems as a country to accelerate innovation? And I think, we've done a lot of work in the reports. We've done a lot of work with some of the supercluster strategies. There's plenty out there that identify the sectors that we can be leaders in. We got to double down on those and drive our investments in those. Okay. Secondly, let's leverage this playbook and the learning that we have through the AI experience. We invested in talent and research. We invested in immigration. We invested in adoption strategies for corporates and SMEs. We invested in a startup strategy to drive outcomes from a lot of that work. And now we're outlaying capital to really drive scale into the sector. Why can't we use that same framework and apply it to other sectors in a meaningful way? And then the third thing I'll say is, if we are going to ramp our investments in these key targeted areas and have strategies that are defined by talent, capital, and customer activity, we need to collect data and measure how well we're doing. Let's set some goals and understand what's working and what's not working and hold ourselves accountable and try new approaches and do some experimentation to be better. But if we don't measure, we can't really understand what's working and what's not working, and we can't learn.
You're preaching to the choir here. There used to be something in the country called the Science, Technology, Innovation Council, which released metrics every 2 years. And several years ago, a new federal government abolished it. Maybe we bring it back or do better, or make it so that we don't need a commission of inquiry to find out what the federal government knows. Oh, was that an editorial comment? I've been pretty good about shortening our the gap between where we're supposed to be and where we are. Thanks to a panel that came loaded for bear, prepared and eager to share their ideas. I'm grateful that they did that, and I'll hand the baton back to Ramel for the next stage of our festivities. Thanks very much.